Support for Our Town Athens comes from Hocking Valley Bank, Athens County's locally owned, locally managed community bank, committed to conducting business in the best interest of customers and community served. Values-guided, community-minded, Hocking Valley Bank, invest in you. Member FDIC, equal housing lender. And by Ohio Health, where health is an ongoing journey and wellness and sickness are part of a lifelong partnership. Ohio Health believes in the patient's power to be healthy. Discover your best health at Ohio Health, ohiohealth.com. Additional support provided by the Athens County Convention and Visitors Bureau, a regional source for event, shopping, dining, and attraction listings. Information at athensohio.com. David White Services, a local premier Lennox heating and cooling company serving the Athens community for 40 years. Information at davidwhiteservices.com. And the O'Neill Hartman Insurance Agency, a local Grange independent agent serving southeastern Ohio since 1964. Information at o'neillhartman.com. And by Carpet One Floor and More, Malika Gall Sloan Ancillary Law, Reed and Bauer Insurance, the Athens Area Chamber of Commerce, Snyder Fuller and Stroh Insurance, and by the following.
In the hills of southeastern Ohio, a winding river flows. It begins as nothing more than a stream, small enough to leap across. But its water is powerful. For more than 100,000 years, the river has sliced through rock, exposing a massive gorge at its headwaters. The view from above led natives to call it Hock-Hocken, or bottle-shaped river. As white settlers arrived, they built mills on its banks, and the water carried goods to distant markets. And on a small hill, overlooking a bend in the river, they made their home in a never-ending forest. As early humans made their way up the valley of the Hock-Hocken, a substantial, flat, glacial outwash known as the Plains developed into one of the largest woodland settlements in Ohio. Cultures known as the Adena and Hopewell inhabited this land from roughly 1000 BC to 1000 AD. They built large earthen structures to both bury their dead and mark their territory. Scholars debate what became of these people, though many believe they developed over time into the historic tribes encountered by early white settlers.
Ohio became the place where lots of different cultural groups showed up, the Shawnee, the Wyandotte, Miami. And so, they had to work things out amongst themselves, and then the settlers get here too.
As soon as the first Europeans entered the Ohio country in the 1600s, they claimed Indian lands. The Hock-Hocking Valley was part of New France until 1763, when the French surrendered it to Great Britain. England then ceded it to the United States after the Revolution. In 1786, a group of American investors recognized a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to purchase the land from the United States and resell it to Revolutionary veterans. The group, led in part by General Rufus Putnam and the Reverend Manasseh Cutler, organized at the Bunch of Grapes Tavern in Boston, and the Ohio Company of Associates was born. They next had to convince the government to sell the land. Perhaps no one was better suited for the task than Manasseh Cutler.
In addition to being a minister, he was also a doctor. And in addition to being a doctor, he was also an astronomer. So you have this very eclectic mix of religion and science and medicine in one individual who's well connected.
He was a remarkable man. And with lots of wheel and dealing, he was able to negotiate and buy approximately 1 million acres in the Northwest Territory for the Ohio Company of Associates.
With their land purchased, Rufus Putnam led a group of 47 pioneers down the Ohio River and into the vast unknown of the Northwest Territory. After a lengthy and dangerous journey, the pioneers landed at the mouth of the Muskingum and founded the town of Marietta.
When you come here with a land warrant from the east that somebody who's never been here gave you, and they're giving away land that actually belongs to native peoples, there's already trouble brewing.
The land was eventually stripped from the Indians after General Anthony Wayne defeated a confederation of tribes at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. The resulting Treaty of Greenville, signed in 1795, pushed the natives out of southern Ohio forever. In 1797, a group of about 20 pioneers, following directions from Rufus Putnam, left Marietta and began a new life on the frontier.
They made their way down the Ohio and up the Hockhocking in large canoes. Having ascended as far as the attractive bluff where the town of Athens now stands, they landed and sought their various locations. The surrounding country was then covered with dense forests, and the echo of their axes was the first sound of civilized industry heard in all this region. Charles Walker.
They brought enough stuff to survive and make a home in what was literally a wilderness. So if you try to think of making a town in the middle of the Wayne National Forest, that's what you're doing.
Could they grow enough food? Could they get enough salt? More than anything else, would I have another woman to talk to? I don't know. I have great admiration for them.
As trees fell and plows tore the earth, Putnam laid out a tiny village on top of the hill, Middletown.
It was called Middletown because it was right in the middle of the two major settlements in Ohio. It was smack dab in the middle between Marietta and Chillicothe.
The centermost part was at the base of what High and Union Street now.
It was originally just 20 little cabins and called Middletown. Later, of course, became known as Athens.
I liked their choice of their place names. They were classical people. Athens County, Athens City, Athens Township. They named all the other townships, Troy, Carthage, Rome. So they picked these classical names, planted them on the landscape, and so that becomes, again, a reflection of their culture in the frontier.
Central to these cultural values was education. The land in Athens and Alexander townships was to be leased, and the profits used for the foundation of a university. And in 1804, the Ohio legislature approved a charter for the Ohio University in Athens. The school opened its doors in 1809, with Jacob Lindley overseeing the inaugural class of 3 students.
And we surmised that they were probably teenager-ish, maybe, and they probably hadn't been in school very much, so they were not taking university classes, but fairly basic things that you might take in high school.
These first 3 students never finished their studies, and the university would not produce a graduate until 1815, when Thomas Ewing and John Hunter received the first diplomas from Ohio University. As the tiny town and school grew together, the landscape around Athens grew with them. Briny water was discovered in wells just outside town, and the production of salt joined fur trading and agriculture as the valley's primary industries.
There was an abundance of underground brine water, which was pumped into large metal vats and then simply heated so that they would boil, and then what was left there, the salt, was then extracted from the process, bagged, and sent off.
Mills appeared along the riverbanks, and in 1805, the Ohio legislature authorized construction of a dam across the Hockhocking, the first in the state's history.
You know, it's a pretty impressive thing that when they settled the Northwest Territory, Cutler and Putnam and these guys, the ideals they settled it with, one, it was going to be based on education, and another idea is that it was going to be free from slavery.
And that was a very radical idea for its time.
A lot of people weren't happy with that. And so as Ohio developed as a state, a lot of the congressmen and representatives were Southerners. And so the Southerners created their slave state by creating what we call black laws. If you were coming to Ohio as a black person, you had to have your freedom papers with you. You had to have a white person vouch for your character, and you had to pay at least a $500 bond, which is a lot of money back in the 1800s. It was almost like a wall, invisible wall, money, white person vouching for you.
Despite these restrictions, in 1824, Ohio University President Robert Wilson returned to Athens with John Newton-Templeton, a freed slave originally from South Carolina. Wilson then enrolled Templeton at the university.
John Newton-Templeton ended up living with President Wilson and his wife Jane, and he was sort of the student servant, is what they called him. That sort of worked off his room and board and the tuition for school.
Templeton excelled in his studies and was an active participant in many extracurricular activities. While John was in school, a movement was underway across the nation to deport freed slaves back to Africa.
The idea is that when you walk down the street in the United States and you saw somebody black, you would know, beyond a doubt, they belonged to someone. They were property. So there's no confusion. Under the guise of, this is your home, you're going to be much happier there because that's where you came from.
The history books read as if they were doing a wonderful thing for the black man. But by the 1800s, the black man had been in America for almost 100 years. Africa was no longer his home. Now, John Newton-Templeton was groomed to maybe be a leader in Africa.
And when I searched for a reason for them bringing John Newton-Templeton here, that's the only plausible explanation.
But Templeton, he had other thoughts.
While John's classmates focused their commencement speeches around Greek or Latin texts, Templeton delivered a carefully crafted oration titled The Claims of Liberia.
When you're black, you have to do black things, or you're expected to do black things. And so I believe that they expected him to do black things, which was to tout the claims of Liberia, to tout the benefits of using Liberia as a homeland.
But he couched his words in such a way that he didn't say it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. Historians sometimes read his speech that he's supporting the mission of colonization, but as a black woman reading that speech, I heard other things in the words that he was speaking. History is like life. It's complicated. It's not straightforward. Having Mr. Templeton live with them and educating him, that was good. President Wilson was part of that colonization group. I often wonder if President Wilson was disappointed in his speech.
Templeton graduated in 1828 and became the first black man in Ohio and just the fourth in the nation to graduate from a university. He went on to a remarkable career in education and never did travel to Liberia. Ohio University's second black student, Edward Roy, was installed as president of Liberia in 1870 and overthrown a year later. As the industries of Athens expanded, a new method of transportation was necessary to get the town's goods to market. In 1843, the Hocking Valley Canal finally reached the city limits and connected Athens to the rest of the world.
But they shipped salt on the canal, they shipped lumber, they shipped lard. Not only did it allow this region to ship products out, it allowed this region to import products that were made in big cities or in Europe.
The canal ushered in a new era of prosperity throughout the valley, and Athens and the university grew up together. Like any relationship, disagreements between the two were a fact of life. One particular quarrel centered around the townspeople's insistence that their livestock be allowed to wander through town at will.
They seemed to think it was just fine to let their livestock, sheep, pigs, whatever, sort of graze around on the green, which made it rather filthy, if you can imagine that. So that was a point of contention for years and years.
When university administrators weren't chasing pigs off the green, they struggled to find ways of keeping the school open. The leasing of public lands did not produce enough money to pay expenses, and enrollment was constantly in flux. In 1839, William Holmes McGuffey, author of the famed McGuffey Eclectic Readers, was named the university's 4th president. McGuffey was notorious for his strict standards and expelled students for the slightest misconduct.
He was also a Presbyterian minister, but it was the old school Presbyterian, and he was hidebound from the beginning. I mean, he was opposed to everything.
Now, student body is already small, and then McGuffey is kicking out people just right and left.
And so enrollment fell, and the city people were tired of him, and he was literally chased out of town.
He had to take a whip with him when he went out in his buggy because people would attack him.
Tired of the constant struggle, McGuffey resigned in 1843, and the university found itself with a crippling debt of $13,000, and rumors of closure spread throughout the halls.
Finally, in 1845, they did close, and they decided, okay, we'll try to pay down the debt somehow, and we'll reopen in 3 years, which they did. Then they got their first Methodist president, Solomon Howard. That made some of the trustees resign. It was just so outrageous, if you can imagine that.
Despite his chaotic tenure, McGuffey made a lasting positive impact when he planted several elm trees on the college green.
And of course, they were sort of a hallmark of the university for about 100 years. In 1860, most of the senior class, which would have been tiny, went off to war. So, you just have this very lean campus for sure.
Athens County is able to claim that it has the highest proportion of Civil War soldiers of any county in Ohio. Out of an eligible population of about 5,000 men, it sends over half, about 2,500, to fight in the war.
Local attorney Charles Grosvenor was promoted to breveted brigadier general, the highest ranking Athens County to serve. After the war, Grosvenor was elected to the U.S. Congress and became close friends with future President William Howard Taft. Among the other fighting men of Athens County was Milton Holland, a freed slave from Texas, enrolled in classes at the Albany Manual Labor Academy, one of the finest schools for blacks in the state of Ohio.
His father was a white man who had the children by a slave woman. He wanted the best for his sons, so he sent them to Albany.
When the war broke out, 16-year-old Milton tried to enlist in the Union Army, but was denied on account of his age and his race. Instead, he spent the first 2 years of the war as a servant for Colonel Nelson Van Voorhees of Athens.
Milton Holland was light-skinned enough that he could, quote, pass. He was offered the opportunity to enlist in this regiment, but he would have to say he was white. And he said, no, I won't say that.
By 1862, the Union Army was so desperate for fresh soldiers that black men were permitted to fight. Seizing his opportunity, Holland recruited nearly 200 black soldiers from southeastern Ohio and rallied at the Athens County Fairgrounds. The men were mustered into the Army as the 5th United States Colored Infantry.
One of the most important battles they fought in was Chafin Farm in Newmarket Heights in Virginia.
These black regiments had white officers. All of the officers had been killed or wounded, so the sergeants took over and led the regiment.
Milton Holland gathered the men together and won the battle of the day. And so Milton Holland was the first person to get a Medal of Honor here in Athens County.
Not only was Holland the first Athens Countian to earn the Medal of Honor, he and 13 of his comrades at the Battle of Newmarket Heights were the first black soldiers in American history to receive the award.
Also, in Holland's case, gave him a battlefield commission to captain. When that got to the War Department, they rescinded it on the basis of his color.
Efforts have been made to reinstate Milton Holland's promotion, but they've stalled in congressional committees for more than a decade. In the spring of 1864, Milton Holland's regiment launched an attack against Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. Among the prison's former inmates was Chaplain Charles McBee, a Methodist minister from Athens.
While he was there, he started a glee club. And one of the songs that they started to sing was the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
The Battle Hymn is known today as one of the most noteworthy songs of the war, but it had yet to reach widespread popularity.
McBee apparently had like what we'd call today a photographic memory. He had read the poem in the Atlantic before he was made a prisoner, and he remembered every single word of it. So the Glee Club, among other things, sang that song, which infuriated some of the guards, which I guess made it even more pleasant for them to sing.
McBee was eventually paroled from prison. Upon his release, he joined the ranks of the Christian Commission and continued ministering to wounded soldiers.
Every place he went, he would be singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. There was a meeting of the Christian Commission at the U.S. Capitol in the House of Representatives chamber. Present were senators, representatives, and President Lincoln. He sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and Lincoln stood up after he sang it the first time, had a tear in his eye, and said, "Sing it again." The Battle Hymn did not really take off until very late in the war and in the post-war years. So he is actually given the prime credit. Might not today be as popular as it eventually became if it hadn't been for him.
In the post-war era, a new movement in mental health care, known as moral treatment, swept the nation.
Moral treatment was the idea, first of all, of establishing nice quality housing and hygiene. You housed people in a building that was meant to inspire confidence in the system and that people could be proud to live in.
As the movement spread, asylums based on a plan by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride appeared across the country. Civil War surgeon and Athens resident Dr. William Parker Johnson spent much of the war helping soldiers with battle-induced mental health complications. After the war, he was elected to the Ohio legislature and campaigned for an asylum to be built in his hometown. Johnson was successful, and in 1868, construction of the Athens Lunatic Asylum began. A young Ohioan named Levi Schofield was selected as the architect, his first major project.
Young fella, 26 years old, and when he designed that, it's likely that he designed the largest building in the state of Ohio, which became the Athens Asylum.
Citizens welcomed the new institution.
It meant jobs. It meant decent jobs. They also knew that they'd be buying bricks off of local brick makers and wrought iron and carriages and everything else.
A small village was established to house the employees of the asylum.
Mechanicsburg, a community that was located out Richland Avenue, where hundreds of people, craftsmen, came to live and artisans to build this building.
Construction continued for 6 years, and the asylum opened its doors in 1874.
First patient was a little girl from Athens County who was brought here by her brother. She had a seizure disorder, 11 years old, and her family brought her to the asylum for treatment. The buildings were oriented to catch the prevailing breeze. There would be large windows that would let in plenty of light. There would be beautiful views of the countryside out the windows. It was very much a part of the community. It was porous boundaries. Grown-ups today recall as children being able to walk up and get ice cream at the dairy operation. Patients worked all throughout the asylum, on the grounds, in the kitchens, in the gardens.
The main form of treatment in that era was being a part of a team of people. The people working on the farm were citizens in full possession of the citizenship and the dignity that comes with that. That's still true today. It's funny how I still work in mental health, and every 5 years or so we'll come out with a proclamation that data show that the best thing for mentally ill people is to have a job and be able to support themselves. I'm reading that thinking, duh. They knew that in the 1870s when they started up the ridges. We don't stop often enough and congratulate ourselves for having done something, at least for a while, that was really nice, an excellent move on society's part.
The asylum remained the largest employer in the city of Athens well into the 20th century. By the late 1800s, the Hocking Valley Canal was obsolete, and a new form of transportation was rumbling through the hills. William Cutler, grandson of Manasseh Cutler, was instrumental in founding the Marietta and Cincinnati Railroad. Like his grandfather, he possessed a fierce determination and was insistent that his railroad not take any unnecessary detours.
They wanted it to run straight. And so when they came into Athens and they wanted to bring it straight up, they wanted to tunnel under the cemetery and bring it straight down and just keep going straight. Go on down and straight on over. They liked straight.
To Cutler's surprise, the citizens of Athens objected to digging a tunnel underneath the West State Street Cemetery and refused to grant the railroad access. While he negotiated his tunnel, Cutler built a temporary shoe fly around the hills of Athens. This new route crossed the land of the Currier sisters, who lived in a large house on the Flatiron Square at the intersection of State and Court Streets. Cutler finally accepted that his tunnel would never be built, so he proposed making the dogleg permanent.
And the sisters says, not on their land are you going to make it permanent. And so they would go down and block the railroad.
The sisters piled logs and other debris across the tracks, forcing trains to stop.
She planted herself on the track with the national flag wrapped around her, exclaiming that she would not be the first person who had died for freedom. She stood her ground, and when the train stopped, the cowcatcher almost touched her. It happened that one of the cars was filled with recruits who, upon seeing her costume, began to gather around her singing, "We'll rally around the flag, boys." Charlie Wood seized a rail to remove it, but she clung to the other end. It was altogether a ridiculous scene. William Cutler.
Can't you just see them lifting that pole up that she was hanging to? Who said women were mamby-pambies?
Several women of Athens made their presence known. In 1873, Margaret Boyd became the first female graduate of Ohio University. Olivia Davidson moved to town after attending school in Albany. She was assistant principal of the famed Tuskegee Institute, where she met and fell in love with Booker T. Washington. The two were married in 1866 in Athens. Eliza Brown moved to Athens after serving as a cook for General Custer during the Indian Wars. While isolated on the plains, she became close companions with Custer's wife, Libby. After the general's death, the two remained friends, and Libby visited Athens on several occasions. When she did, they dined at the famed Hotel Berry on Court Street. Owned by local African-American businessman Ed Berry and his wife Maddie, the Berry Hotel was known across the country as one of the finest in operation. Ed Berry worked as a brick mason during construction of the asylum, and then started a small confectionery with Maddie. From there, the two opened their hotel and became one of the most successful families in the city.
First of all, it was a beautiful building. The food was exquisite, the rooms were very meticulously kept, and they were among the first to make sure that there was a Bible in every room, that there were like sewing kits, little things that we now all take for granted when we walk into a hotel room.
People from all over the country would say we're going to Athens to the Berry. Today it would be rated as a 4 or 5 star hotel.
The Berrys donated funds to Ohio University for the construction of the College Gate. They were also instrumental in the formation of Mount Zion Baptist Church, donating the land for the building. As Mount Zion was going up, North Hill, right next to the church, was coming down. Its clay transformed into one of the hallmarks of Athens history, bricks.
Part of Court Street was probably part of North Hill. After 10 years, they mined it back almost 300 feet.
A rail system transported the clay from North Hill to the Athens brick plant on Stimson Avenue, where it was fired in beehive kilns and transformed into millions of bricks.
They made a lot of brick. They started out shooting for 40,000 bricks a day. At one point, there were more like 70, 80,000 bricks a day. They've employed at their peak 130 to 150 people. So it was one of the biggest businesses around. You'll notice it has a name on it and these lines, but when they were set into the street, they were set in with this side facing up. So the brand wasn't even showing. They also had these lugs, these raised areas, and that was so when they put them in the street, they were evenly separated from one another.
Some bricks featured backwards letters to differentiate one batch from another. Others, known as hill bricks, came equipped with beveled edges to provide better traction for horses pulling loads up the inclines of Athens. In 1903, Congress passed legislation to provide the National Guard and regular Army with the same training and equipment. Joint exercises were scheduled, and in 1904, 6,000 Ohio National Guardsmen and 1,000 U.S. Army regulars invaded the hills around Athens. The troops were divided into two armies. The Blue Army camped in Armitage, and the Brown Army camped near Beaumont. The armies maneuvered through the hills in mock battle, firing blank ammunition. The war games were meant to be friendly, but conflict simmered in the ranks.
The regular army thought the National Guard were incapable of fighting a real war. They thought they were amateurs. The National Guardsmen felt that the regulars were mercenaries who did not fight for family or freedom or their country. They fought for money.
The soldiers fought all day, and many slipped into Athens to drink all night. One Army regular, Private Kelly, had a few too many and became unruly.
The reports say that he's in the Badlands. That is the west side of Athens, the working class area where there would have been a lot of working class drinking establishments.
Private Kelly was arrested by a unit of National Guardsmen and taken to the county jail. When word of his arrest reached camp, roughly 100 regular soldiers fell into formation and marched on Athens to free their comrade.
They march up the railroad tracks through town and confront the Ohio National Guard provost in front of the jail, which is now the sheriff's office. Quickly, it devolves into a shootout.
When the smoke cleared, the regulars scattered. One soldier drowned trying to cross the swollen Hocking River. Corporal Charles Clark, a National Guardsman from Warren, Ohio, lay dead on Washington Street.
He was young. He was in his early 20s, and he was actually about to get married. They suspected they knew who pulled the trigger. The regular who drowned, a lot of it got put on him conveniently. If this were to happen nowadays, it'd be a huge, huge scandal. But at this point in time, the National Guard and the War Department were looking to get along. And the very next day, the armies were back out there maneuvering in the hills.
Despite a chaotic start, the Ohio National Guard went on to serve valiantly in many conflicts. In 1917, Major Samuel Morrow Johnson of Athens led a unit of National Guardsmen on a parade down Court Street to the newly constructed armory on their way to World War I. In addition to the armory, the early 1900s saw tremendous growth. The old South Bridge was replaced with a new concrete span. On College Green, a new auditorium was built in memory of the soldiers of World War I. The name was later amended to recognize John Newton-Templeton and the first black woman to graduate from Ohio University, Martha Hunley Blackburn. Court Street was packed with various shops and services, including David Zenner's dry goods store.
By all accounts, it was one of the most luxurious dry goods stores in the region. So very, very successful, very wealthy. His son Henry takes over the business. And in 1905, a young inventor, kind of a tinkerer, Charles McBee, approaches Henry Zenner for $10,000, which would have been a lot of money in 1905.
McBee worked as the freight agent for the B&O Railroad in Athens and spent his days stuffing railroad receipts into tiny pigeonholes for filing.
And he thought that there could be a better way. There had to be a better way. And so he started tinkering in his shed and came up with a binder system.
Zenner took a chance on the young inventor, and the McBee Binding Company was formed. Zenner served as president and McBee vice president. The pair shopped their new invention to railroads across the country.
Charles McBee was presenting to this railroad company, and the company executive asked him, well, who's going to supply the binders? And he said, we will. So they became not just a binding machine company, but also a company that made the binders for their machine.
McBee binders and filing products were shipped across the nation, and the tiny startup became one of the largest employers in town. They remained an Athens institution until the 1990s. As America plunged headfirst into World War II, the male population of Athens quickly fell. A small number of recruits were housed in barracks on College Green, constructed during World War I.
I'm sure the girls were happy about that, but except for them, there's not a lot going on in terms of masculine presence.
While the men of Athens fought around the globe, one woman did her part back home.
Seriously, one of my favorite women in Athens history. Her name was Margaret McGrainer, and she was called the Athens Magazine Lady.
As the war raged, Margaret McGrainer saw a daily parade of trains passing through town, carrying troops to the front.
So she looks at her husband and says, we should really do something for the boys on the train. And together they kind of rounded up about 70-some magazines and went down and distributed them to the soldiers.
The story of the Athens magazine lady went viral. People across the country rounded up thousands of magazines and shipped them to her door.
And she had like 1,500 magazines at one point on her porch. She had articles written about her in American Magazine, was featured in a radio show that broadcasted out of Hollywood. And included in a lot of these magazines, she would put a little note card that had her address. And she received mail from hundreds of soldiers, and she corresponded with several of them throughout the war.
November 15th, 1943. Dear Mrs. McGrainer, you won't know in the least who this is, but I'll try to introduce myself. One day, as we were passing in a troop train, we stopped in Athens. You were at the station giving out packages of cards. I was one of the lucky soldiers to get one, and that's why I'm writing you, to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Since then, we have crossed the ocean and arrived in North Africa, and still the cards are with us. I'm sorry I haven't written to thank you, but I wanted you to know how much they were appreciated. Private First Class, Peter Barone.
By the end of the war, she calculated that she had distributed 500,000 magazines and thousands of decks of playing cards. It's just a really wonderful, wonderful story of one woman in Athens doing something extraordinary during really extraordinary times.
When the war ended, Athens was flooded with new students, many returning veterans taking advantage of the recently passed GI Bill, and the town and university rolled toward the 1950s. In 1958, Athens High and Ohio University graduate Dow Finsterwald took the golf world by storm, winning the PGA Championship and being named Player of the Year. In his honor, the city of Athens hosted Dow Finsterwald Day at the Athens Country Club. The day featured a friendly round of golf. Finsterwald's group included Arnold Palmer and an 18-year-old amateur from Columbus named Jack Nicklaus. The match at the Athens Country Club would be the first of many historic battles between Jack and Arnie. Finsterwald won 11 PGA victories, was named to 4 Ryder Cup teams, and finished in the money in 72 consecutive tournaments, second only to Byron Nelson. While the kings of the golf world were showing their stuff on the links, another king was taking to the streets.
The 1960 King Midget model by Midget Motors Corporation will be your new car if the price is right. Price Authority, Midget Motors Corporation, Athens, Ohio.
That's the cutest looking car I've seen.
Sure looks cute there, doesn't it?
I'll start at $100.
$100.
Midget Motors operated in Athens throughout the 1950s and 60s and produced a variety of street-legal microcars. Priced at around $500, the tiny King was at one time the world's least expensive automobile. The Midget packed some respectable horsepower, and the hills of Athens were the perfect location to test out the mighty car. When Ohio University President Vernon Alden wasn't cruising the back roads in his King Midget, the ambitious young leader had his sights set on a new solution to one of Athens' oldest problems: floods.
We used to have good floods. Suddenly, there were new dormitories built in the floodplain, and people were saying of all the stupid things, building buildings in the floodplains. There was a joke that went around. People said, "Oh, I saw President Alden this morning and he was crying." And we said, "Vern, what's wrong?" And he said, "I just found a mud puddle without a dormitory in it." Well, it turns out that then the Board of Trustees was able to go to the state and say, "Look, we've got all this valuable property that's being flooded. We never had valuable property getting flooded before." And they started moving the river.
Moving the river was just one of many signs that times were changing.
My brother had just returned from serving in Vietnam. The war was very much on everyone's mind that freshman year. And at the time, the draft was in force.
Mayberry RFD will not be presented tonight because of the CBS News special reports. The Draft Lottery, a live report on tonight's picking of the birth dates for the draft.
So college students felt it very clearly.
September 14-0-0-1.
College students were frustrated with that war.
In the spring of 1970, protests erupted on campuses across the country. In Ohio, Governor James A. Rhodes dispatched the National Guard to quell the dissent. And on May 4th, 1970, 4 students were gunned down by National Guardsmen at Kent State University. Kent State and most schools in Ohio closed immediately. But Ohio University President Claude Soule was adamant that his campus remain open.
President Soule decided that he wanted to show the country that a school could protest, we can be peaceful and still get things done.
I remain confident with what I have seen at Ohio University over the last 5 days that we can remain open. In fact, I said to the university community today that this may really be Ohio University's finest hour, and I hope we can persevere.
An era of frustration, anger, and anguish shrouds the Ohio University campus today after a night of violence and tear gas. Reports say that rocks were thrown and windows were broken by about 200 students out of the school of 19,000.
Everything pretty much boiled up, boiled over, and then shut down. President Soule closed the university in the middle of the night. We were all glued to our radios, and he just said, "You're all going home."
When things finally came to that pass and the students were leaving, then the National Guard came in to, quote, keep the peace as the students left.
The young men, the same age as the college kids, were lined up at parade rest every 10 feet along the sidewalk with their guns out.
It just hurt so bad. Once the bricks started flying and there was destruction of Court Street, it was hard living in Athens, being from Athens at that point, because I knew some of those shop owners. I knew the children of some of those shop owners were friends and acquaintances of mine, and I could understand what they were thinking.
I guess you can agree with somebody's goals, but be totally disagreeing with their tactics.
Classes were canceled for the rest of the year, and there were no commencement exercises.
My husband had his 3 graduate students that he so badly wanted to finish, and they finished their classes in my living room.
And I returned to campus the following year as a sophomore, and basically you couldn't tell anything had happened. It was almost like a really black eye that you wanted to heal quickly over the summer.
In 1981, a design from Athens High graduate Maya Lin was chosen from more than 1,000 submissions in a contest to design the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. Lin's concept represented a wound in the earth, a symbol of the tremendous loss of life in Southeast Asia. In 2017, a traveling recreation of the wall was installed in Ohio University's Bicentennial Park, also designed by Maya Lin.
How do you know to move forward and upward to make America better if you don't understand where you've been?
All those elements, whether it's our founding or the Athens Asylum or Ohio University, they're all kind of stepping stones in this whole development to lead us to where we are now.
What do we have if we don't have our heritage, both our natural heritage and our cultural heritage? It's our heritage that defines who we are as an individual, as a family, as a state or a nation. And when we lose parts of our heritage, we lose a part of ourselves.
The downside, I think, that we see often is not visioning forward and looking at an asset that is historical in nature, and instead thinking, okay, it's better just to rip this thing out and put something else in its place.
The history that went with them can be written on a page. We can talk about it, but it's not the same thing as stepping inside that building and feeling it.
Athens has seen many historic landmarks come and go. The McGuffey elms were removed in the 1950s, victims of Dutch elm disease. Ed Berry sold his hotel in the 1920s. Its classic architecture was later replaced with a modern facade. The building was eventually purchased by Ohio University, demolished in 1974, and turned into a parking lot. But Ed and Maddie's other major contribution to the community, the Mount Zion Baptist Church, still stands. The church was a mainstay for the black population of Athens for decades. Today, the Mount Zion Preservation Society is working to rehabilitate the 100-year-old structure.
We want to make this a place for people to meet, for lectures, presentations, weddings, those kinds of things. But we would also like to make it a repository for Black history.
Advances in psychiatric medicine allowed patients to be treated in their communities, and the Athens Asylum closed its doors in the 1990s. The asylum is now owned by Ohio University.
The Athens Asylum remains probably one of the most complete asylum campuses left in the country.
Its dairy barn housed a milk operation for decades, but it too has been saved and reimagined.
This used to be a working dairy barn for 60, 70 years, and for the last 40, it's been an art center. The news got out to the community that the county and state were planning to tear down the barn. So a local group of artists, they petitioned the state and said, you know, why tear this down? Give us a chance. And that was 9 days before they were going to tear down the barn. We can provide local artists some inspiration from outside the region, as well as inspire folks right here and give them an opportunity to sell art and to exhibit art.
The Athens County Historical Society obtained the historic Silas Bingham House and relocated it to Richland Avenue. It housed many important Athenians, including President Robert Wilson, his wife Jane, and John Newton-Templeton. Other examples of historic preservation in Athens include the Southeast Ohio History Center, housed in the historic First Christian Church.
We have about 70,000 items in the collection. It's not about the stuff, it's about the stories that the stuff tells. We want people to be able to find themselves in these stories that we tell.
Even the streets of Athens themselves remind travelers of the city's past.
The Athens Canal. It's almost like sacred ground to me to look, and you can see the chink marks in the stone that was hand-hewn. And it was, you know, our forefathers that put those there. So it's good to understand and realize the blood, sweat, and tears that went into building this city so that everyone learns from the past, understands the past, and how you weave that into progress and moving forward.
Athens is not just an old town with an old university. It's a place that's active and vibrant now, and our history is still being made. We want to preserve all of that, tell that to future generations. History is everything.
Support for Our Town Athens comes from Hocking Valley Bank, Athens County's locally owned, locally managed community bank committed to conducting business in the best interest of customers and community served. Values-guided, community-minded, Hocking Valley Bank, invest in you. Member FDIC, equal housing lender. And by Ohio Health, where health is an ongoing journey and wellness and sickness are part of a lifelong partnership. Ohio Health believes in the patient's power to be healthy. Discover your best health at Ohio Health, ohiohealth.com. Additional support provided by the Athens County Convention and Visitors Bureau, a regional source for event, shopping, dining, and attraction listings. Information at athensohio.com. David White Services, a local premier Lennox heating and cooling company serving the Athens community for 40 years. Information at davidwhiteservices.com. And the O'Neill Hartman Insurance Agency, a local Grange independent agent serving southeastern Ohio since 1964. Information at o'neillhartman.com. And by Carpet One Floor and More, Malika Gall Sloan and Sillery Law, Reed and Bauer Insurance, the Athens Area Chamber of Commerce, Snyder Fuller and Stroh Insurance, and by the following.